So I'd like to introduce you to three artists of the federal period. And to be clear, by the federal period, I mean the early United States. So this is roughly about 1890 to, let's say, 1810, where the United States is kind of forming its identity. And each of these works by the three different artists that I'll present, I think really reflect the larger socio-cultural ideas of this moment in time, as well as the institutions that existed. So I'm showing you the work of the first artist. This is Samuel Jennings, who created Liberty Displaying the Arts and Sciences in 1792 for the Library Company in Philadelphia, which had really made a big effort to support abolitionist politics. So this work, remember, is based on the idea of abolition, meaning the freedom from slavery. So the idea here is that this figure, who is a Roman freed slave, and I know that because she has broken chains at her feet, and she holds this staff and the cap that was worn by Roman slaves who'd been set free. So she is the embodiment, essentially, of liberty. And what she's presenting us with is the idea that learning, that books are the pathway to liberty. And all of these other aspects of learning are also important. We've got a reference to astronomy, to sculpture, to architecture, to painting, to music, to geography. All of these things are essential, right? But what I would argue is that at the very core, this work is inherently racist, because although the idea of liberty is presented, that liberty can be achieved through knowledge, learning, education, what we see is that it's actually very few slaves who have joined, who've come inside and have tried to grasp the ideas that she's presented about learning. The great majority of the slaves are outside. They're singing, they're playing music, they're dancing around the maypole. And I want you to remember this because this is a common stereotype. You'll see it represented again and again in American painting as a way of justifying this enslavement of an entire race of people. The presentation is often that look how happy they are. They're playing music, they're dancing, they're singing, that it's not really that bad. They actually don't mind being enslaved. That's the propaganda. That's the idea that is being pitched with many of these images. And what's fascinating is that the few, the two men, the woman, and the child who've come to listen to what liberty has to offer them seem to be kind of overwhelmed. You know, this guy looks as though he's perplexed, as though he can't quite grasp what she has just said. So it's an interesting attempt at abolitionist ideas, and yet I think the underlying racism of America in 1792 is really what's presented in a very clear manner. Another example of this kind of racist imagery is this work by John Vanderlyn, which depicts these two Native American figures as absolute savages. They're strong, they're powerful, they are like sculpture. In fact, John Vanderlyn had studied in Paris and copied works at the Louvre Museum, so he knew a lot about Renaissance painting and sculpture, but he's, created these deranged, crazed Native Americans who are threatening and about to kill this poor white woman who is one of the colonials. This is a story based, or a history painting really, based on a story from the American Revolution. And the story was that Jane McCrae had left her family home in upstate New York, and she was running off to meet her lover, who, if you look closely, you can see off in the distance. It's just that he comes a little bit too late. So before the two can meet, she's captured by these Native Americans, and she is savagely scalped. This, by the way, is about one of the raciest images you'll see in American art history. Her blouse is coming undone. She's the personification of liberty and patriotism, as her clothing is pink or red, white and blue. And she is helpless. She is this poor, helpless figure who's being overpowered by these two savages. Now, this is also based on a notable poem that was written about this event, and it goes like this, quote, "She starts with eyes upturned and fleeting breath, in their raised axes views her instant death, spreads her white hands to heaven in frantic prayer, then runs to grasp their knees and crouches there. Does all the eloquent suspend the knife? Does no superior bride contest her life? There does. The scalps by British gold are paid." So what that little piece of information tells us is that not only are these Native Americans savages and brutes, but they are also easily bought out. So what was happening here is that the British were paying Native Americans for colonial revolutionary scalps. So they're being paid by the British to make an effort to subdue those colonial rebels. So we see not only the idea that they're barbaric, but also that they are easily bought out. They can easily be bribed to kill colonials. And of course, the British forces with whom her lover had allied himself are to blame. John Vanderlyn made one other attempt at a historical or mythological painting, but I think, as you can imagine, it was wholly unsuccessful in the United States. It's a mythical subject. It's Ariadne asleep on the island of Naxos. So this comes to us from Greek mythology. She had she had helped this figure, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on his name, Theseus, there we go, to slay the Minotaur, and then he ultimately deserts her on this island. So what you see off in the distance is Theseus, who is about to take off, and he's leaving Ariadne asleep here. It's really, you know, the kind of work that would be popular in France. It's no surprise that John Vanderlyn was working in Paris at the time that he created this, and it was a way to create discreetly erotic works. But this is the kind of thing that was very unsuccessful in the United States. And lastly, I come to Charles Willson Peale, who was a clocksmith and a silversmith and a saddler, and also an early portrait painter. But he went to New England first, studied briefly with John Singleton Copley, and then decided it was necessary to go to England, where he spent 2 years studying with Benjamin West. I mentioned to you before that Benjamin West is an important mentor for a lot of younger American artists. Charles Willson Peale was a little unusual, though. He was more interested in creating portraits rather than history paintings like West and Copley, and he realized that he wanted to return to the United States and that he wanted to paint portraits because that's what the American public wanted. So on the left, I'm showing you a portrait that he did in 1788 of William Smith and his grandson. William Smith was a Baltimore merchant who had been elected to Congress, and he really wants us to be remembered as both a congressman. So we see this federal architecture that looks like buildings in Washington, D.C. there behind him, but we also see the farmhouse, and we see his grandson. So we're reminded that he is both, you know, a farmer, a man of the earth, as well as an official in the government. So he's remembered as both kind of the gentleman and the farmer. And the work that I'm showing you on the right is, in fact, a self-portrait. This is Charles Willson Peale painting himself in 1822, and it's called The Artist in His Museum. And it was commissioned at this time when Charles Willson Peale was 81 years old. He decided that he was going to gift his museum collection to the Philadelphia Museum. And in turn, they asked him to do a self-portrait. Now, here's the important thing. Charles Willson Peale is one of the first Americans to open a museum. So again, it's sort of like the prisons that we talked about in the last lecture. We assume that museums have always existed. They have not. This is a very new 18th century concept. People had private collections. Kings, wealthy people collected artifacts, artworks, natural history specimens, but they were not open to the public. And so it's not really until the 18th century in Europe and the United States that we see the first public museums. And Charles Willson Peale opened his as a museum of fine art and natural history. It was near his home in Philadelphia, and he wanted the average person to be able to come and see these specimens of birds that he had collected. In fact, he was a taxidermist himself, and he taxidermied a lot of these birds. So if you look really closely, you can see the tools. The taxidermy tools are here in the left foreground. But he's also a painter, so he created portraits that you see throughout this gallery space, and his palette is right there behind him. You also see this great skeleton, or a little bit of it there in the background, and that's a mastodon that Peale had been part of the excavation of that specimen. So he very proudly, like, a circus director, pulls back the curtain to show you not only his natural history specimens, his bones and his birds, but also the portraits that he had created. So this is an important work that reflects on this institution, the idea of a public space where people could go to learn more about art or science or history that is new in the West, both in the United States as well as Europe.